Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Wall of Power TV. I'm your host, Paul Metsa. Our guest tonight, Andrea Swensson, is an author, a radio host, and music journalist. She hosts the local show at Minnesota's Public Radio's 89.3 The Current. Before joining NPR, she was the music editor at City Pages. She has written a wonderful new book called Got to Be Something Here, The Rise of the Minneapolis Sound. We're really delighted to have her here for the whole show tonight. Welcome, Andrea.
Thanks for having me.
Yes, I am really enjoying your book.
Oh, good. I'm glad to hear it.
When did you've been writing about music for a long time and listening to music, I'm sure, longer. You're a native of Moose Lake, Minnesota,
Yes.
which I pass every time I'm going up to the Iron Range for the holidays. When did you tell yourself, I think there's an idea for a book here?
I think the seed was planted in 2012. You probably recall the Secret Stash
Right.
Twin Cities Funk and Soul compilation
Yeah.
coming out. And that was just a revelation, I think, for a lot of people, that there was so much music and so much history in this scene that wasn't documented.
And that those tapes still existed.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that the musicians are still around
Right.
playing, and they are talking to each other, and all these memories are just kind of floating in the air. And so I went to a rehearsal for the big launch party for that compilation, and I met a lot of the musicians for the first time, like Willie Walker.
Right, my good buddy.
Yes, and the Valdons. And
I remember you called me. Now, Willie and I have been playing together. Willie Walker, as he used to be known, is now known again for, I think we're going on 7 years. And I remember you called me about that time and said, you got Willie's number? And you told me what you were working on. And so I'm glad I was able to hook you up.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I appreciate that. He was amazing.
Yeah.
The first chapter actually starts with him.
Right.
He has so many really vivid memories of those very early days. You know, he started playing in the Twin Cities in 1960.
Right.
Singing with fellow teenagers in the
Right.
North Minneapolis neighborhood. So there were all these stories just kind of percolating, and I just knew that someone needed to turn on a tape recorder
Right.
and write these down. And I didn't know that that would be me for maybe 2 years after that. But in 2014, I started working on it in earnest, and I'm really glad that I did.
Well, that's a great, you've got a great radar as a journalist to feel that. It's been so interesting. We recently had Terry Katzman on, an old friend of mine who talked about the Savage Young Do, the Husker Du compilation. And then before that, Chris Reimenschneider. And, and you look at the books that have been written just in the last handful of years
Right.
about the Twin Cities music scene. And what a treasure trove of experiences that people have been able to capture
Right.
and share.
Right. Yeah, and I think all credit goes to the two kind of regional publishers that we have in town, the University of Minnesota Press, where I published my book, and the Minnesota Historical Society
Absolutely.
Press. They really turned an interest area. They found that this is like a very fertile ground for storytelling.
Right.
And I'm just really grateful that they're supporting people doing that.
And that their readers are kind of in that demographic that knows about the history as well and
Right.
lives some of the history.
Right.
But yes, I think that's a good point. My book, Blue Guitar Highway, was put out by the University of Minnesota Press in 2011, and your book, Got to Be Something Here, when was it actually, the release date?
October 10th of this year.
Oh.
Yeah, it's very new.
So you've been busy.
Oh, yes. Yeah, we had a big launch party at the Fitzgerald Theater.
Right.
Willie played.
And the Valdons.
And the Valdons, and Wanda Davis, and Andre Simone, and
Wow.
it was just incredible. I don't think I've ever had an experience like that before. It was so profound to see everyone coming together, not just from, one particular scene, but across generations.
Right.
And realizing that this story, started in the 60s, but is still going on today.
Right.
And we had Nookie Jones as the house band, and Paviel singing, who's just contemporary, amazing singer. And to see these basically 3 generations coming together and saying, yeah, this is a
Fantastic.
really incredible community that we've built. It was really profound.
Were you able to audio and videotape that
Oh, yeah.
show? Because boy, do I see a KTCA Channel 2 documentary right around the corner.
That would be really cool.
Yeah. We'll just walk down the hall, right?
Yeah.
Or across the street. When did you really start to listen to music? And
Oh, gosh.
what turned you on to your love of music? It continues to this day, I might add.
My parents.
Okay.
I mean, it was a very young age. It was a very musical house. My mom played piano. My dad played guitar. They had amazing record collections, and that was kind of what we did as a family. Was listen to music together, dance together.
Oh, how much fun!
It was just very. I'm an only child, so it was just the three of us, and that just started so early. I remember my dad even teaching me lessons through music. Like if I threw a fit, he would sit down and play me the Rolling Stones. You can't always get what you want.
Oh, nice. Good work, Dad.
So it was just kind of woven into my life
Right.
very early on. And then I took an interest in music from an early age. I started playing piano and flute and was in the band at Moose Lake. And then when we moved down to the Twin Cities when I was about 12, then all of a sudden I had access to this
Right.
whole big world.
Right.
I had MTV for the first time, and I could go to the
Right.
record stores
Sure.
in Minneapolis, go to the Electric Fetus and things like that. So it's just kind of been part of my DNA, basically.
Well, I was just, the book really kind of wraps up with Prince and how he came of age. I just hearken back to that beautiful picture of Prince going through, the record collection and the magazines just a few weeks before he died
Right.
at the Electric Fetus.
Right. I actually was in there just last week, and the manager, Bob, told me that fans are coming in from all over the world and standing where he stood in that
Wow,
picture
to get a
their
picture.
own picture taken so they know that they stood right where Prince was.
Cool, and then there's, in the background up on the wall is the poster of Tom Waits.
Yeah.
Well, there's a lot of things I love about your book, Andrea. Got to be something here, but the pictures are phenomenal.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Tell us, how many photos do you think are in the book?
I believe there's over 80.
Wow.
Yeah, and we were really intentional about how the pictures were used and what pictures were chosen. I really didn't want it to feel like you were only going to look at the pictures and skip over the stories.
Right.
So we made them black and white and kind of in the text, and I kind of pictured it like a textbook.
Yeah.
They're just kind of helping to illustrate the stories. But then we found them from so many different sources. I did a lot of research at the Historical Society, at the downtown Minneapolis Central Library. They have a special collection.
Talk about that, because
Yeah.
I was on the fourth floor, correct?
Yep.
And I was there, I forget exactly what I was looking for, but that's where I saw they had the picture that you have in there of the Prince Rogers Nelson trio.
Yes. A lot of them honestly came from people's personal collections. There's a band called The Family that I go pretty in-depth in one of the chapters. They were basically the big brothers of Prince and Andre Simone and Morris Day in North Minneapolis.
Well, in that picture that I was just talking about, the Prince Rogers Nelson trio, Andre Simone's dad is playing bass.
Yeah.
So tell us about that when that story.
Yeah, that was such a cool moment. So I interviewed Andre a couple times actually for this book, and he was remembering back to this very specific moment where he met Prince on the first day of 7th grade at Lincoln Junior High in near North Minneapolis, and they immediately had this connection of, oh, we both are music people, we need to jam. So Prince invited Andre to his dad's apartment where there were all kinds of instruments for them to play with, and Andre was looking at the piano, and there's this little photograph of Prince's dad and his band, and he said, gosh, that guy looks like my dad. And Prince's dad came home after work that day and looked at Andre and looked at the picture and looked at Andre again and was like, I know you.
Wow, how phenomenal
There were
is that?
so many stories like that. That neighborhood was so tight-knit and that community was so small that it was basically like a big family, that everyone kind of knew each other and looked out for each other. So I love that story.
You know, playing with Willie Walker is an honor, but hanging out with him is so much fun.
Yeah.
So we've really got to know each other, driving to gigs together, hanging out on the gig on the breaks. And so I've heard stories about the Cozy Bar and all the King Solomon Mines. And what's the one I can't pronounce? The one that's
The Nakarima?
That's America spelled
Yes.
backwards, right? So I've heard about these places through Willie,
Right.
and then actually see the pictures was really great.
Right. Yeah, and some of those came from the Historical Society has a huge archive of photos by Charles Chambliss, and that was a treasure trove. They actually just put out another book from the Historical Society Press just of his pictures. He did not just music, but kind of daily life in North Minneapolis.
Wow.
And really documented the 1970s African American community. So there's so many just little slice of life pictures where maybe you wouldn't think to take a photo of a band, you know, just sound checking in an empty bar, but then all of a sudden you get the sense of the space and what it felt like to be in there.
And 40 years later, we have got to be something here. We have Andrea Swensson on, lovely author, radio host, and all-around cool music person. For the whole show night on Wall of Power TV, stick around. We'll be back after these messages.
I want you to meet Two Gingers Irish Whiskey. I'm Kieran and I'm Irish, so I tend to like a challenge. Why not? I wanted a whiskey to help find me out what's out there. Like what's really out there. And I found the oldest distillery in Ireland with a water wheel and awards for its small family of whiskies in the middle of Ireland. As I've always seen it, you can't win the lottery unless you buy a ticket. So try it. The investment is small and the flavor is big. It's perfect for drinking neat. Its character holds up, like the Irish, when the bastards try to get you down. Two Gingers Irish Whiskey. Distilled twice for more character, time for more flavor, and less of the old burn. No lite bastardes carborundum. Don't let the bastards get you down.
Welcome back to Wall of Power TV. I'm your host, Paul Metsa. I hope you've been enjoying this show. We've got Miss Andrea Swensson on for the whole night tonight. Andrea, where did the title come from?
A song.
Is it?
Yes. So there's so many great songs that I discovered through the research process. One of them, it's billed as the Lewis Connection, but the people that actually recorded on it were this band, The Family, that got started in North Minneapolis in the early 70s at the Way Community Center.
Right.
And
Spike Moss, right?
Yes, Spike Moss was their manager.
Right. I saw it, because anybody who's been involved with Minneapolis politics for the last 35, 40 years, you bumped into Spike at some point.
Yeah.
But it was so great to see that picture of a young Spike.
Yes.
Yeah. Handsome guy.
Yeah, he was very involved in the Way. The Way was built basically in the immediate aftermath of the first unrest that happened in North Minneapolis in 1966.
Right.
And by the early 70s, it was the place to hang out for all of these young kids coming up in the neighborhood. So there was a music room where you could go and jam and play all these different instruments, and this band formed called The Family. And their history is just fascinating because they ended up mentoring this whole generation of young kids that we associate now with the Minneapolis sound, like Prince and Morris and Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis. The Family was led by Sonny Thompson, who went on to play in the NPG with Prince and Sonny T, and a lot of other really talented musicians in this group. So they wrote and recorded this song called Got to Be Something Here. And the lyrics and the sound of it and then this backstory, they all just really spoke to me. They actually hired Prince to play guitar on the recording, so very quietly you can hear him a little bit in the background.
Right, and so how old would have Prince been, 15 at the time?
He would have been 17, I think. He was about to go to New York and try to shop his demos around to Warner Brothers. And he actually used the money from that recording session to buy the plane ticket.
Oh, cool.
So just a fascinating story. And then, the idea of there's got to be something here for us, which is what the lyric is. It really speaks to, I think, the theme of the book, which is that this African American music community was basically being ignored by everyone outside of their immediate neighborhood. And they still managed to persevere and to book gigs and make records and form this scene that eventually became world famous. But they had to overcome a lot to do that.
Well, you, in the beginning of the book, you talked about the Rondo neighborhood, which would be kind of between, let's say, Dale and Lexington on either side of 94, very thriving black neighborhood. And so you get into a lot of the politics and the segregation back there. But there's a great quote in there. Believe it is every freeway is a political act.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, that really spoke to me after researching. You realize that we kind of take these roads for granted. We use them to just whip back and forth between the two cities, but to plan out where those roads go and why. It's basically following a path of least resistance. And this is true of pretty much every major metropolitan area, that it's the poor areas, it's the areas where minorities live that ended up getting bulldozed to make way for these roads. And that was certainly true of Rondo. The people that lived there didn't even know that these discussions were happening about building 94. There were two proposed routes, one which would have run along, they called it the St. Anthony route, which goes basically behind, I think it's called Territorial Road, along where the train tracks run. And that was ignored as a potential because it was so much cheaper and faster to just go right through the heart of this neighborhood.
And they sure as hell weren't going to build a highway down Summit or Grand.
Well, yeah.
You know.
But the culture that existed there and the neighborhood and the people, it was such a small area, and it was where so many of the African Americans who moved here in the 40s and 50s ended up going to live. And to just wipe out that neighborhood and take out the core, I think 80% of the residents had to be displaced. That just absolutely obliterated the sense of culture, this kind of core, the sense of community. It took out music venues. It just made it really difficult to still feel that kind of vibrant sense of like we're together doing something right now. So it just had a massive impact on music and in addition to just daily life. So I really wanted to get into that because I think it's just yet another example of, you know, all these barriers that were put up in front of people that were just trying to live and trying to make art. And I just feel like people my age need to know about this.
We're going to jump around. That's what we do here in Wall of Power TV. So where have you been going for your readings, and what sort of response have you been getting?
Well, the biggest launch was at the Fitzgerald Theater. Like I mentioned, we had live performances, but I also told some of the stories from the book. I talked about Rondo, I talked about North Minneapolis and the construction of the way. And it was interesting to take that kind of presentation to a place like the Fitzgerald Theater, which is, you know, most known for Prairie Home Companion, and to really try to tell this other kind of story about Minnesota music history. And at times it was not pretty, you know, you're getting into some pretty hard truths. And that was just such a profound experience for me to be able to tell these stories, but then to have the evening be so full of joy and such a celebration of these artists. So that is just going to stand out for me forever as a highlight. But I've also done things at the Electric Fetus and the Bryant Lake Bowl. I'm going to be popping into many of the bookstores here in town, like Moon Palace. I did something at Majors and Quinn, of course.
My favorite bookstore in the world, Majors and Quinn.
Me too. And the Harmar Barnes & Noble.
Yeah. Oh, cool. Harmar Superstar.
Yes.
Yeah, I bumped into Harmar. I just saw one of his first time I'd ever seen him, and we hang out at a place occasionally called Grumpy's Bar in Northeast, and I was telling Harmar, I said that was that was like the last place you'd go and find Radio Shack.
Yeah.
And they had a beautiful theater there too. I don't even know. I haven't been there in a while. We've got Andrea Swensson on. She has her own show called The Local Show on 89.3 The Current. NPR. What day of the week and what time is it?
Sunday nights at 6 o'clock.
Sunday at 6. We're going to be talking more about her great book, Got to Be Something Here, and more on Wall of Power TV. Stick around. We'll be back after these messages.
There's always something going on at Grumpy's. For happy hour on Monday, it's half-price beer and wine. Killer prices on local taps all day Saturday, and bottles of wine at half price every Sunday. At night, the turntables at Grumpy's stay busy with the Minnesota Music Listening Party on Monday and Vino Vinyl on Thursday night. Trailer Park Trivia packs the house on Wednesday night at 8 p.m. And don't miss T-Bone Bingo on Sunday nights. They have it all. Every night of the week, it's Grumpy's Northeast.
Welcome back to Wall of Power TV. I'm your host, Paul Metsa. My guest in the show all night tonight, Miss Andrea Swensson. She's telling a fascinating story of how she put together her book, Got to Be Something Here. I loved reading about the young Jewish guy with the recording studio in his basement of his parents' house.
Yes.
Tell us about this guy, and tell us how he got into recording, because the whole thing is really kind of an interesting story about emerging technology.
Oh, absolutely. So in the 1950s, North Minneapolis was predominantly a Jewish neighborhood. And it was also where an increasing number of African Americans were migrating to. So there were these two kind of cultures coming together. And David Hursk was an enterprising young man from North High School, and he was going to his Hebrew lessons to prepare for his bar mitzvah when he was 12 or 13. And he noticed that his teacher, in order to teach him the proper dialect, was recording his voice onto a record, which is crazy to me. I really want,
Right.
I really want one of these.
Right, no doubt.
But at the time, you could buy blank records and then a record player that had a little knife on it that would cut and actually record raw audio onto a 45 for you. So a little light went off, and he said, "Okay, I need to learn how to use that. He asked for that for his bar mitzvah present, and he started recording.
Sounds like the kind of kid that didn't subscribe to Mad Magazine and read comic books, but like he would go to the library and read Popular Mechanics.
Right.
You know, at 12 years old with big glasses, right?
Yep, exactly. So he started buying these blank 45s, and he realized that it was cheaper to record a song off the radio onto a blank 45 than to buy the new one. And he started calling into WDGY and requesting songs. And then at one point, I think the announcer even said, "This is for young David, are you ready?"
Wow.
And then did a little pause so he could put his little needle down. And then he would cut these 45s. And then he started selling them.
Wow.
Because, you know, he just
That's
was
the
very
good part of
enterprising.
Minneapolis, right? Not the segregated part, but the cool side.
Yeah. So this all snowballed until he figured out around the age of 15 or 16 that he could actually record bands and make original 45s for these bands.
So, and what year was this, Andrea?
He started recording in, I think, 1956.
Wow.
And they ended up being the first recordings of any rock and roll music, any R&B music. He actually cut the first R&B record to ever come out of the state of Minnesota in 1958. The band
That's
is called,
incredible.
I know, it's crazy. The band was called the Big M's. And there were a couple bands of similar kind of music. It was basically doo-wop at this point, kind of pre-R&B
Sure.
even. There was a band called the Velquins, and there was a band called the Wisdoms, and I was able to interview David. Unfortunately, he just passed away last year, but I interviewed him right before he passed away, and he was telling me these amazing stories.
And of course, you have all your interviews on tape,
Yes.
right?
Oh, yes.
Okay, so
Yeah.
they're going to find a happy home soon.
Yes. Yeah, and I made sure to record, with a really good microphone to
Good.
get this history down. But yeah, he was telling me that he was so impressed by these young bands that he wished that he had connections to Motown or to somebody at a big record label that could have distributed them outside of the state. Instead, they would cut 500 copies. Some of those ended up just being lost.
Right.
The acetates of all these recordings ended up getting pitched because he left them in his parents' basement, and when he got married, they threw away all of his stuff. So unfortunately, it's just limited to the few these R&B 45s. There's just a few copies of them floating out, and I was able to find one.
Wow.
So that was a really
Where'd you
big
find it?
win on eBay.
Wow, cool.
Yeah, but I guess there is another copy in the metro area too. So it's fascinating to me how, that was such an active scene, and the only thing that we know about it is what was captured.
Well, what was interesting, Andrew, when I was reading the story about David, enterprising young man, you think about late 50s, early 60s, whenever it was recorded, it wasn't cheap.
No.
Tell us about that, because you had to come up with some scratch to get this stuff recorded.
Yeah, he charged $1,000 for the recording time and for the records. And I asked him, how did a teenager in 1958 come up with that kind of money? And he
That'd
said,
be like $50,000 today.
he said their parents paid.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, he was just like, whatever,
Wow.
But it was worth it to
Oh,
them,
absolutely.
to be able, that was such a legitimizing step to be able to take as a young performer. Like, I have a record. That's so cool.
So back then, were they able to get airplay anywhere with those records?
No, not in the late 50s. There was some interest in TV, interestingly enough. There was a show on KSTP I think it was called Take 5. And they had local bands come on, and teenagers would come on the set and dance. But it really was a kind of upsetting story to hear recounted, because when these young doo-wop bands came on, the producers didn't want them dancing with any of the young white women.
Right.
and they actually filmed them from the waist down. So you could only see them playing their guitars and seeing people's feet shuffling around, but they didn't want
The complete
to.
opposite of Elvis.
Exactly. But they didn't want to show the black performers on TV. So really upsetting.
Yeah.
But in the 60s, there was more interest in radio, in the community radio. There was a station called KUXL that was active in North Minneapolis.
And that was just for the neighborhood.
It was, yeah. The studio was just over the border into Golden Valley. I think it was actually in an old hotel they would broadcast out of. And yeah, just reached right into near North and kind of the other way, a little bit into Golden Valley. But you had to live there to hear it, so they physically couldn't reach outside of their neighborhood.
Kind of the predecessor to KMOJ.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly, yep.
We were talking a little earlier in the show about how the Rondo neighborhood in St. Paul was basically decimated by '94, but then so was part of Plymouth Avenue in North Minneapolis.
Absolutely, yeah, and again, that was a cultural hub. Dating back to Prohibition era, there were jazz clubs along Olson Memorial Highway. That was a really, really active music spot. The Cozy Bar later on became very popular. The Blue Note, which was a jazz club.
Well, then you have one of the greatest jazz bass players of all time, Oscar Peterson.
Yes.
Was from Minneapolis.
Yep.
Lester Young,
Yes.
the saxophone player, used to live just right outside of Minneapolis. But you had kind of, I know a little bit about that history, and that's why your book kind of starts in 1958. But in the 30s and 40s and early 50s, the Flame was a jazz club for a while on 15th and Nicollet.
Right.
And you had all these after-hour jams going on where Duke Ellington would show up, or Fats Waller. So tell us about the clubs on the north side. There was the Cozy,
Yes.
right?
Yes, absolutely.
Well, Willie Walkies play there all the time.
Oh yeah. That ended up transitioning to another club called the Riverview. That was really popular.
That was a great place. That was right on the river.
Yeah.
They had several shows there. I think Morris Wilson, who is in your book, great guy, did some shows there. Also, the Radiators from New Orleans used to have their annual show at the Riverview.
Okay,
Yeah, gorgeous
cool.
spot. Andrea Swensson, the pride of Moose Lake, Minnesota, and my new friend. Thank you so much, Andrea.
Thank you for having me.
Have a wonderful holiday season.
You too.
All
Thank
right,
you.
sell some books.
I will.
All right. Thanks for watching Wall of Power TV. We really appreciate your time. We've got some great shows coming up. I'm your host, Paul Metsa. Have a wonderful night.